Hello, friends. Today is December 10th, and our story today takes place in Romania, 1989. It is ruled by Nicolae and Elena, dictators since 1965. Now, in 1965, they had promised the people of Romania that basically this is going to be a communist utopia. But it didn't happen that way, of course. As a matter of fact, soon afterwards, they basically became brutal dictators under a communist umbrella. And as is inevitable with such governments, living standards just kept going lower and lower and lower. By 1989, bread was rationed. People had to stand in lines for it. Soy was substituted for meat just so people could get some protein. Desserts were forbidden. There wasn't enough energy to keep apartment buildings housed or heated rather, so people had to wear coats inside their apartments. People who spoke out against the government, they were turned in by the secret police. Matter of fact, 435,000 people murdered or disappeared during Nicolae's reign for speaking out against the government. Gasoline was rationed. Anybody who was trying to leave the country, they were thrown in prison. TV was broadcast for 2 hours a day, but most of it was communist propaganda, and all of it had to be approved by the government. Even water was rationed by 1989, and so things in Romania were not good. Enter Pastor Laszlo. Now, Pastor Laszlo was a pastor of one of these forbidden churches that were illegal, and he came across some records from better times, records of baptisms and the types of records that churches usually keep. And for something just grabbed him, and he said, "You know what? It is time to come back to church." So he tracked down the people in these records and the descendants of the people in these records and said, "It's time to come back to church. God is calling you to follow him no matter the cost, whether it's illegal or not illegal." And surprisingly, they came. Pastor Laszlo's church boomed, despite the fact it was illegal. And Pastor Laszlo, he taught good theology. He taught strong discipleship that can often cost you things. Now, many people in his church ended up being sent to prison because the secret police would infiltrate the church, pretending to be people who were interested in Christianity, and then they would report the men that they knew, and those men would be taken from their homes and sent to prison. So many people in Pastor Laszlo's church would end up in prison. In a Romanian prison, in those days, a communist prison, the conditions were bad. I mean, really bad. I mean, if you're wearing a coat in your own apartment and not enough energy for heat and barely enough food, and you're a legal citizen, imagine what a prisoner is going to get, right? It's not good. Richard Wurmbrand, he founded Voice of the Martyrs. A lot of his stories come from Romanian prison. So it wasn't good. One of the worst parts about the particular prison that Pastor Laszlo's congregation was sent to was the speakers. There were speakers throughout the entire facility, and they would just broadcast communist propaganda 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, constantly lies about how communism is so wonderful. There's no getting away from it. It's old school reprogramming. Brainwashing is an old term for it as well. But the people of Pastor Laszlo's church, they were not ready to give in. You know, they had been taught well, and so they prayed. They looked for Jesus. They pursued him despite these horrible circumstances they were in, this 24-hour broadcast that was trying to eat away their faith and get into their brains. They prayed, and they held out, and they wanted to see Jesus. They looked for him because they knew that God was with them no matter where they went. As for Pastor Laszlo himself, he became the target of the government. He was persecuted. First, they took his food cards away from him and his family. And his congregation, they made up for it. They didn't have much food themselves, but they snuck him food. They snuck him firewood, and so he was able to eat. So that didn't work. So next, the government decided, we're just going to assassinate him. And so they sent a team to do that. Pastor Laszlo survived through kind of a miraculous turn of events. of events, but he got some knife wounds to his face, some other things, but he survived. Finally, the government just said, "We are done with you. You are being evicted from your apartment, and then we're going to bulldoze your church." The church had, of course, they opposed this, and but Pastor Laszlo asked them to come and see him as he was being evicted. He wanted people there. He said, "Don't be violent, just sing and just pray." And so they did. Now, here's the thing, though. Pastor Laszlo's church was quite large at that time. It was 5,000 strong. And so you have this large crowd across from this apartment building where Pastor Laszlo is about to be evicted. And right across the way, there's also a train station. And so the people would stop at the train stations. The trains would stop, and they would see a large crowd, and they would wonder what was going on. So they went over, found out what was going on, that these people were opposing the government because of all of the things that was going on, and this pastor was being evicted. And so the crowd began to grow. It got larger and larger and larger, singing and praying. Pretty soon, other congregations, secret congregations from around that also began to come. So this huge crowd is there, right? And this is alarming, of course, to government officials. And they won't disperse. As a matter of fact, night comes on, and they just start lighting candles, and they're singing and they're praying. They won't go away. But the government wants to disperse them. So the next day, soldiers come. And they set up water cannons, and they're just going to make sure that these people leave. And so they spray the water cannons at all the people. But the people rush the soldiers and get to the water cannons. They disassemble the water cannons, and then they go back to singing and praying. And the crowd continues to grow. As for Pastor Laszlo, he's captured. He's beaten. He's sent to prison. But the crowd, it doesn't stop them. They continue to pray. They continue to sing. Tanks and dogs are now going to be used against the crowd, and that happens, but they still won't disperse. The crowd just keeps growing. Romanian flags are starting to show up, but they're Romanian flags, and the communist symbol has been cut out of them, and now they're starting to wave these flags. Nicolae is out of patience, and he orders the soldiers to shoot. And so the soldiers begin to shoot. First warning shots, and then shots to wound, and then shots to kill. 1,000 people died because of the soldiers shooting into the crowd. But despite all of that, the crowd still does not disperse, even after the shooting stops. The soldiers begin to reevaluate who their enemy is. Is it really these people in front of them? Or is it Nicolae? A few days later, Nicolae makes a speech. It's December the 22nd, 1989. And this speech is carefully choreographed. It is there are actors among the crowds to prompt the people to shout and react in certain ways, and cameras will center on the actors so that they can have a nice set piece on television. And so the speech begins so that Nicolae can declare that law and order has been restored in Romania. But after, as began the speech, Nicolae began to be booed. And he was shocked. He was stunned. He had lost control of the people, and he didn't know it. And pretty soon he would realize he had lost control of the soldiers too. They began to chant, God, the crowd began to chant, God is with us. God is with us. The broadcast was cut, but the cameras continued to record. Nicolae, he ended up fleeing. He got into a helicopter and left, and he was going to flee the country and get to safety. But the helicopter, it broke down. And when it landed, he tried to commandeer a car with him and his wife. And so they did, and they said, take us across the border. But the owner of the car who's driving them realizes who he has in the back seat, so he doesn't drive towards the border. He drives back to where Nicolae came from, to the soldiers that had turned on him. Christmas Eve, 1989. A huge crowd had gathered once again, 200,000 strong, chanting in the heart of the government building, "There is God, and God is with us. That same chant that had started when they had tried to evict Pastor Laszlo from his apartment. That night, the government fell. Nikolai was tried the next day, Christmas Day. Evidence was presented against him about all of the atrocities he had committed. His soldiers, his own soldiers, ended up killing him when they became convinced of his injustices. But to the men that had been arrested in Laszlo's prison, in Laszlo's church, many days before, they knew none of this. They were just in prison, 24/7, listening to communist propaganda, 24/7. And so it's about Christmas Day at 2 o'clock. And all of a sudden, the speakers go silent. I'm sure the men looked at one another, just what's going on. Can you imagine what silence sounds like after you haven't heard it for days and days and days? After a very long time of silence where the speakers said nothing, a voice came through on the speakers on Christmas Day at 2 o'clock. And it said these words. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered there with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. The speaker did not stop reading until he had finished the entire account of Luke chapter 2. And the prisoners learned of how God had answered their prayers. Grace and peace to you, my friends. And remember, as always, not to forget the important things this season. Take care.